In 1921, the United States government did something that most history books refuse to say out loud. It sent warplanes over American soil. It dropped bombs, not on a foreign enemy, not on a distant battlefield thousands of miles away, but on its own citizens, on its own land, in its own mountains. The men below were not soldiers. They were not criminals. They were coal miners, fathers, brothers, husbands, and sons who had spent their lives crawling through the earth to keep the lights on in a country that did not protect them. And today, most people have never heard what happened to them. This is the Battle of Blair Mountain. Subscribe for more shocking American history. To understand why 10,000 men picked up rifles and marched into the mountains of West Virginia, you first have to understand what their lives actually looked like, because it was not living. Not really. In the early 20th century, coal was the blood of the American economy. It heated homes, it powered factories, it kept the railroads moving, and the men who pulled it out of the ground did so at enormous personal cost, physical, financial, and human. West Virginia's coal fields were not simply places of work. They were total systems of control. Mine owners did not just employ these men. They owned them, or as close to owning another human being as the law would allow in 1921. The miners lived in company towns. They did not choose their homes. The company assigned them. They did not shop where they pleased. There was one store, the company store, and that was where you bought your food, your tools, your clothing, everything your family needed to survive. And in many cases, workers were not even paid in real United States currency. They were paid in scrip, company-issued tokens that were worthless anywhere outside the company's own ecosystem. You could not save money. You could not leave easily. You owed the company for your housing. You owed the company for your tools. You owed the company for the very lamp you wore on your head when you descended into the dark. The hours were brutal. The conditions were deadly. Men lost fingers, hands, and lungs. They died in collapses, in explosions, in slow suffocations brought on by years of breathing coal dust into lungs that were never designed for it. When a man died in the mine, the company expressed its condolences and found another man to take his place. And watching over all of it were the mine guards, private armed security hired by the coal operators to ensure that no one caused trouble, no one organized, no one complained too loudly. These were not police officers bound by law. They were company men, loyal only to the people who paid them. And they operated in the coal fields with near total impunity. For the miners, there was one possible path toward anything resembling dignity or fairness. That path was called a union. But the mine owners had made very clear what they thought of unions. By 1920, the tension in the West Virginia coal fields had been building for decades. Organizers from the United Mine Workers of America had been moving through the region, trying to sign men up, trying to give workers some collective voice against the coal operators who controlled every aspect of their existence. The operators pushed back hard. They evicted union sympathizers from company housing. They fired men suspected of organizing. They used their private guards to intimidate, to threaten, and when they felt it was necessary, to do far worse than threaten. In Mingo County, things had already reached a point of open violence. The so-called Matewan Massacre of 1920 had seen gunfire erupt in the streets of a small West Virginia town between mine guards and local law enforcement. Men died on both sides. The region was a powder keg, and everyone knew it. Then came the match. Sid Hatfield, the police chief of Matewan, and a man beloved by the miners for his willingness to stand up to the coal operators, was murdered on the steps of the McDowell County Courthouse in August of 1921. He was shot down in broad daylight by agents working for the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency, the same private security firm that had long terrorized the coal fields on behalf of the mine owners. The effect on the miners was immediate and absolute. Hatfield had been their man. He had stood with them. He had faced down the coal operators and their hired guns, and he had not blinked. And now he was dead, killed in front of witnesses, and there was no indication that anyone responsible would face any meaningful consequence. Across the coal fields of West Virginia, men who had been quietly seething for years made a decision. They were going to march. What assembled in the late summer of 1921 was not a protest march in any conventional sense of the word. This was an army. Somewhere between 10,000 and 15,000 coal miners gathered and began moving through the mountains of West Virginia toward Logan County, where a staunchly anti-Union sheriff named Don Chaffin had built what amounted to a small private military force using funds supplied by the coal operators. Logan and Mingo counties remained non-Union territory, and the miners intended to change that. Many of the men who marched had served in the United States military during the First World War, which had ended just 3 years earlier. They knew how to move in formation. They knew how to hold a defensive line. They carried their own rifles. They organized supply lines. They established communication between units. They tied red bandanas around their necks to identify one another in the chaos of the mountains, so that in the confusion of what was coming, they could tell friend from foe at a glance. It is from this moment, from these red bandanas worn by these miners in these West Virginia mountains, that the word redneck entered the American language, not as an insult born from sunburn, but as a badge worn by working men who had decided that enough was enough. Blair Mountain stood between the miners and Logan County. It was a long, heavily wooded ridge, and Don Chaffin's forces had dug into it with rifles, machine guns, and every advantage that defensive high ground provides. The miners would have to go through it. On August 25th, 1921, the shooting began. The coal operators were not going to let this stand. They had money, they had political connections, and they had the ear of people who could bring to bear resources that no private army of mine guards could match. They called on the federal government. President Warren G. Harding declared the situation in West Virginia a state of insurrection, and the United States government responded not with negotiators, not with investigators sent to examine the conditions that had driven 10,000 men to take up arms, but with force. Federal troops were dispatched. But before they even arrived in significant numbers, something else happened, something that had almost no precedent in American history. The U.S. Army Air Service sent aircraft over Blair Mountain. Private planes, some hired by the coal operators, had already been flying over the miners' positions, dropping homemade explosive and gas bombs. But now, military aircraft joined them. The government of the United States of America was using air power, the same air power that had been deployed against German forces in the fields of France and Belgium just a few years before, against American workers on American soil. Let that land for a moment. Men who had fought for this country in the trenches of the First World War, who had come home and gone back into the mines and tried simply to earn a living that did not kill them. Those same men were now being bombed by the government they had served. It was one of the only times in the nation's history that the U.S. government deployed military aircraft against its own civilian population. The miners held on. For 5 days, they fought. 5 days of rifle fire crackling across the mountain ridges, of men advancing and falling back, of makeshift field commands and desperate logistics. They were outgunned, outnumbered in terms of resources, and they knew it, but they held on. It was, in the end, the arrival of regular federal troops that broke the miners' will to continue, not because they feared the soldiers as enemies, but because many of them had been soldiers themselves. They had fought under that flag. They had bled for it, and they could not bring themselves to point their rifles at men wearing its uniform. The surrender was not cowardly. It was the decision of men who understood exactly what they were being asked to do and who found they could not do it. Hundreds of miners were arrested. Many were charged with murder. Some faced charges of treason and conspiracy against the state of West Virginia. The legal system wielded like another weapon by the same coal operators who had built the conditions that led to the uprising in the first place. Dozens had been killed over the course of the battle. The exact number has never been established with certainty because in 1921, in the coal fields of West Virginia, no one in power was particularly interested in counting the dead miners carefully. The miners lost the battle. In the short term, the defeat was devastating. Union membership in the West Virginia coal fields collapsed. The coal operators tightened their grip. The company towns kept running. The script kept getting handed out at the pay window. But the battle had been seen. It had been reported. And what Americans saw when they looked at it, if they were willing to look honestly, was a system so brutally unjust that tens of thousands of working men had felt they had no choice but to go to war against it. The struggle at Blair Mountain became part of a larger national reckoning with the relationship between labor and capital. Over the following decade, and especially during the New Deal era of the 1930s, the legal landscape began to shift. Workers gained the right to organize. Collective bargaining received federal protection. The conditions that had made Blair Mountain possible, the total corporate control of human life in the company towns began slowly to erode. The miners who marched did not live to see most of it, but it came. In 1921, the United States government dropped bombs on its own people, not because they were enemies of the nation, but because they were enemies of a system that depended on their silence, their poverty, and their despair to function. They refused to be silent, and the government sent planes. History is not always a story of nations at war with other nations. Sometimes it is a story of power at war with the people living underneath it. Sometimes the battlefield is not in some distant country. Sometimes it is in the mountains of West Virginia, and the men on the wrong end of the bombs are fathers coming home from a shift in the earth who simply wanted something better for their children. Most people have never heard of Blair Mountain. Perhaps it is time they did.